December 1941. In the Russian winter, war was no longer measured in front lines, but in frozen breaths and shrinking chances. 19 kilometers. That was all that separated Field Marshal Fedor von Bock from the Kremlin. At Khimki, on rare, clear days, German forward units advanced close enough that Moscow no longer felt distant, but instead became a concrete objective directly ahead of them. No other Wehrmacht commander ever came closer. For roughly 72 hours in early December, many German commanders believed that the fall of Moscow was only a matter of time. The Soviet capital, the political heart, the symbol of resistance, the core of an entire state, stood within reach. And the man standing at that doorway was Bock, a commander who had won every campaign placed in his hands. Then everything collapsed. Not in one dramatic battle, but step by step. Over the following weeks, Soviet counterattacks steadily forced Army Group Center to retreat, dozens, and eventually hundreds of kilometers away from Moscow. Within weeks of the Soviet counteroffensive, Bock was removed from his command. The closest Germany ever came to capturing Moscow ended in disaster, and the field marshal who had brought victory within sight was left carrying the blame. The real question is not whether Bock nearly took Moscow. He did. The question is why the final 19 kilometers could not be crossed, and why a man who kept winning battles still lost the campaign. The answer reveals a fatal contradiction at the heart of the German military system. Tactical brilliance serving strategic madness, professional skill enabling monstrous evil. This is the story of how Germany's most successful field marshal brought his army to the edge of the Soviet capital, and how that apparent victory dissolved in the Russian winter, taking with it his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life. The Treaty of Versailles felt like betrayal. Territorial losses, military restrictions, crushing reparations. Worse was the Kaiser's flight into exile, the monarchy's collapse, the disappearance of the crown that had commanded their loyalty for generations. Some sources suggest that Bock, grappling with this crisis, may have expressed the question haunting many Reichswehr officers. The crown is gone, the army remains. To whom do we owe our oath now? During the chaotic 1920s, Bock operated within a military culture that quietly tolerated efforts to bypass the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. It was technically illegal, possibly treasonous. But to officers like Bock, it seemed like simple patriotism. This willingness to place military necessity above legal authority would prove fatally convenient when Hitler arrived. Adolf Hitler's rise in the early 1930s confronted Bock with his greatest moral dilemma. He was a monarchist watching a former Austrian corporal seize Germany's reins. The Nazis' crude anti-Semitism, street violence, and contempt for traditional institutions likely offended his sense of proper order. But Hitler promised to restore German military power, to tear up Versailles, to make Germany strong again. For Bock and many German officers, that promise outweighed personal distaste. One account describes a conversation that may have occurred among officers wrestling with this decision, possibly in 1933 or early 1934. According to this version, a fellow officer posed the question, do we serve Germany, or do we serve this Austrian corporal? If such a conversation happened, Bock's response perhaps captured the rationalization, allowing the German officer corps to serve Hitler. We serve Germany. The Führer is merely temporary. Germany is eternal. It was a miscalculation that would haunt him. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 a.m. Along the German-Polish border, hundreds of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. Aircraft followed, waves of Stukas and bombers. Then came the Panzers. Bock commanded Army Group North for this operation, controlling General Georg von Küchler's 3rd Army and General Günther von Kluge's 4th Army. The campaign demonstrated modern warfare conducted by a master tactician with overwhelming force. The Polish army never had a chance. Bock's forces didn't attack positions directly. They flowed around them, cutting communications, encircling formations before they could react. This was warfare as Bock had envisioned it, destroying the enemy's ability to fight back. A Polish officer captured after the Battle of the Bzura River in mid-September perhaps tried explaining the shock. "Your panzers came like thunder. We thought we had time to establish positions, organize artillery, and coordinate with neighbors. But before we could complete preparations, your infantry was already behind us, cutting telephone lines, blocking retreats. We didn't lose battles. We never got the chance to fight them." Poland fell in 5 weeks. By the end of the campaign and the occupation that followed, hundreds of Polish towns and villages had been heavily devastated. Poland made Bock's reputation. France made him a legend. In May 1940, Bock commanded Army Group B for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. The German plan bypassed the Maginot Line by sweeping through Belgium and Holland, then driving south through the Ardennes. Bock's forces played a crucial role, drawing Allied forces north, while Army Group A executed the real knockout blow through the Ardennes to the south. France fell in 6 weeks. On July 19, 1940, Adolf Hitler promoted Fedor von Bock to Field Marshal, along with 11 other senior commanders. He was 59 years old, at the height of his powers. But something had changed between Bock and Hitler. The Führer, intoxicated by unexpected victory, had begun seeing himself not just as a political leader, but as a military genius whose intuition surpassed professional judgment. And Bock found it increasingly difficult to defer to what he saw as amateur interference. Accounts from other officers present during this period suggest Bock may have expressed frustration to a fellow field marshal. "He rewards us with medals while ignoring our counsel. We explain operational realities, and he dismisses everything. Victory has made him deaf to reason." It was a small crack in the edifice of loyalty. That crack would widen during Operation Barbarossa. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Along an 1,800-mile front, 3 million German soldiers waited. At 3:15 precisely, 3,000 artillery pieces opened fire. The eastern sky lit up, and the ground trembled. Moments later, the Luftwaffe roared overhead. Fedor von Bock commanded Army Group Center, which included roughly 900,000 soldiers and about 1,700 tanks, while German air support was provided separately by the Luftwaffe. His mission? Advance through Belarusia, destroy Soviet forces, capture Moscow before winter. As the barrage began, some accounts suggest Bock may have addressed his staff with words capturing both confidence and time awareness. According to later accounts, many German commanders believed the Soviet Union could be defeated within 12 weeks. It was remarkably accurate. What Bock couldn't know was that Hitler's interference would waste 6 of those 12 precious weeks. The initial advance exceeded projections. By June 28th, German forces had encircled Minsk, capturing approximately 300,000 prisoners and thousands of tanks. A Soviet prisoner from those chaotic weeks perhaps tried explaining the hopelessness. "We had no chance. Your aircraft controlled the sky, our planes destroyed on the ground. Your tanks moved faster than we thought possible, appearing in rear areas before we knew they'd broken through. Your infantry seemed everywhere at once." By mid-July, Bock's forces approached Smolensk, just 300 kilometers from Moscow. Victory appeared certain. Then Hitler intervened. In early August, as Bock prepared to continue the Moscow advance, Hitler ordered him to halt and redirect significant armored forces north and south. Bock protested vigorously, arguing that Moscow was the strategic prize, that maintaining momentum was crucial. The argument perhaps reached its peak during a conference at Führer headquarters on August 4, 1941. Accounts suggest Bock's frustration showed in ways that shocked junior officers. The exact words are lost, but the substance was preserved in his war diary. "We are permitting our greatest chance of success to escape us by this restriction placed on our armor," Bock reportedly insisted. "Moscow is the hub of Soviet transportation, the political capital, the psychological center. If we take Moscow, the entire system may collapse. Every week we delay, they grow stronger and we grow weaker. Hitler's response, according to those present, was dismissive. You think like a Prussian staff officer, Field Marshal. I think like a revolutionary who understands broader realities. The industrial areas of Ukraine, the oil of the Caucasus, these matter in a long war. Trust my instincts. Bock likely left thinking what he couldn't say. Your instincts will cost us Moscow. From early August to late September, Army Group Center continued limited operations, but its main armored forces were redirected north and south, which removed the momentum needed for a direct advance on Moscow. The delay was strategically disastrous. Weather was still good, roads passable, the German army at peak strength. Instead, Bock watched the calendar move toward autumn. Every day meant Soviets digging deeper positions, bringing up fresh divisions, preparing for battle. Finally, in late September, Hitler authorized resuming the offensive, but the operational window was closing. September 30th, 1941. Army Group Center Headquarters. Wall maps showed Moscow approximately 400 kilometers east. Bock's forces had been reinforced to unprecedented strength. The force Bock assembled for Operation Typhoon numbered approximately 1.5 million men, more than the initial Barbarossa force. He had 78 divisions, including 14 panzer and 8 motorized divisions. Accounts from officers present suggest Bock may have addressed commanders with confidence bordering on certainty. Gentlemen, Moscow lies 400 kilometers ahead. I calculate we will reach the Soviet capital within 3 weeks. Within 6 weeks, we will celebrate Christmas in the Kremlin. The enemy is breaking. One more push, and this campaign ends in victory. The attack began October 2nd with massive barrage, followed by coordinated assaults. Initial results seemed to vindicate Bock completely. At Vyazma and Bryansk, Bock's forces executed perhaps the war's most successful encirclements. By October 13th, approximately 650,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in 2 massive pockets. A Soviet officer captured during Vyazma, when interrogated days later, perhaps tried explaining the chaos. Everything collapsed quickly. One moment we held positions, the next we had no contact with neighbors, no communications, conflicting orders. Some said hold position, others said retreat, others said counterattack. By the time anyone figured out what was happening, your panzers had closed the pocket. For a brief moment in mid-October, Moscow's fall appeared inevitable. German reconnaissance reported chaos, roads clogged with refugees, signs of panic. Then the weather changed. Mid-October in Russia is when autumn rains transform the landscape in ways almost impossible to understand without experiencing it. The Russian word is rasputitsa, literally the time without roads, when unpaved roads become impassable, when ground itself turns liquid. On October 18th, Bock made a personal inspection visit to a panzer division reporting inability to advance. What he found must have struck like a physical blow. Tanks and trucks weren't stopped by enemy action. They were simply stuck, sinking into mud with wet concrete's consistency. Soldiers tried pushing vehicles by hand, their boots making obscene sucking sounds. Horses died in their traces, working to death. A panzer commander standing beside his immobilized tank with mud caking his uniform may have reported, Herr Feldmarschall, with respect, we cannot advance another meter. We cannot retreat. Supply vehicles behind are stuck as badly. All we can do is wait for the ground to freeze. The mud has stopped us completely. Bock's response, if accounts are accurate, showed both determination and growing recognition of catastrophe. Then we hold and wait. The frost will come. When the ground freezes solid, we'll resume. But waiting meant losing time, and time was the resource Germans couldn't afford to lose. Statistics tell a story of incomprehensible waste. Approximately 35,000 men were lost to disease, exposure, and accidents during weeks stuck in mud. 250 tanks broke down or were abandoned. Supply lines collapsed. Fuel couldn't reach the front. Ammunition couldn't be brought forward. An entry that might have appeared in Bock's war diary, though expressed in cautious terms, could have captured growing desperation. October 22nd. Forward elements within 80 kilometers of Moscow. Some forward units reported that Moscow lay within striking distance, although the city itself was still beyond clear visual range for most German forces. Yet we might as well be 800 kilometers away. The mud has brought our advance to complete halt. Every day costs irreplaceable time. Winter approaches. While Germans struggled, Moscow transformed into a fortress. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had been placed in charge of the city's defense, organizing defense in depth. On November 7th, 1941, despite the German army positioned less than 100 kilometers away, Stalin ordered the traditional Revolution Day parade to proceed in Red Square. It was calculated defiance. Troops who marched that morning marched directly to defensive positions. The ground finally froze in early November, turning mud into concrete hard ridges. But the cold brought its own horrors. By late November, temperatures fell well below freezing, and by early December, extreme cold approaching minus 30 degrees Celsius struck German troops who were unprepared for winter, and the German army, still wearing summer uniforms, was dying of exposure by thousands. A German Lancer perhaps wrote in a letter home, "I can see Moscow's towers when air is clear. I counted them yesterday. 7 spires and what must be the Kremlin. We are so close. But what does closeness matter when I cannot feel my feet? What good is victory tomorrow when I might freeze tonight? The cold here is beyond anything we were told to expect." Despite the cold, despite exhaustion, despite mounting casualties, Bock pushed forward. By early December, the northernmost German units had penetrated to Khimki, barely 19 kilometers from the city center. Elements of German forward units reached the Khimki area, marking the closest approach to Moscow. Although historians still debate which formations advanced that far, the closest the Wehrmacht ever got. Then, on December 5th and 6th, Zhukov unleashed his counteroffensive. In the early hours of December 1941, across multiple sectors of the frozen front around Moscow, Soviet artillery opened fire and signaled the start of a large counteroffensive the Germans had not expected. Hundreds of guns carefully positioned during the weeks Germans struggled through mud. The barrage was followed by waves of Soviet infantry, many of them fresh units transferred from Siberia and the Far East, along with other reserves, and they were equipped for fighting in extreme winter conditions. At Army Group Center headquarters, Bock began receiving reports of attacks almost faster than staff could plot them. Not local counterattacks. This was a general offensive along the entire front, with fresh Soviet forces appearing where German intelligence had insisted no significant reserves existed. An operations officer, voice rising with barely controlled panic, could have reported, "Herr Feldmarschall, they are attacking everywhere. Every sector reports Soviet advances. These aren't the same units we've been fighting. These are fresh troops, well-equipped, coordinated. They knew exactly where our weakest points were." Bock, studying the developing situation, likely felt his stomach clench with realization. Zhukov wasn't just defending Moscow. He was not simply defending Moscow, but attempting to drive Army Group Center back and inflict serious damage that would break its offensive capability. "Order all units to hold positions," Bock probably commanded, voice steady despite crisis magnitude. "We'll form hedgehog defenses and wait for the Soviet attack to exhaust itself." But the Soviet attack didn't exhaust itself. It intensified. The next week became a nightmare of desperate fighting in sub-zero temperatures. German units, already weakened by months of combat and brutal cold, found themselves facing numerically superior forces attacking from multiple directions. A Soviet soldier, one of thousands participating in the counteroffensive, may have recalled the grim satisfaction of turning tables. The fascists who had advanced so confidently, burning our villages and killing our people, now ran like frightened rabbits. But rabbits run quickly. The Germans, weighed down and slowed by a cold that froze their fuel and seized their weapons, couldn't run. The winter they failed to prepare for became our ally. We didn't even need to kill many. The cold did our work. Over the following weeks, Soviet counterattacks steadily forced German forces to retreat dozens, and eventually more than 100 kilometers, and the hope of capturing Moscow gradually collapsed. The casualties were catastrophic. By late December 1941, Army Group Center had suffered over 100,000 casualties, along with hundreds of tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces destroyed or abandoned during the winter retreat. Thousands of vehicles and hundreds of artillery pieces were left behind. The carefully organized formations that had advanced methodically through autumn had dissolved into fleeing columns of frost-bitten men concerned primarily with surviving. The failure was so complete, so sudden, so unexpected that it shook the entire German military establishment. For 2.5 years, the Wehrmacht had seemed invincible. Now, for the first time, German forces were in full retreat. Someone needed to be blamed. December 18th, 1941. A telephone call from Führer headquarters reached Bock's command post. The message was brief and devastating. He was being relieved of Army Group Center command, effective immediately. The official reason was health concerns. Bock had been suffering stomach ailments. But everyone understood the real reason. Hitler needed someone to blame for Moscow's failure, and Bock had made himself an easy target through repeated strategic disagreements, his insistence that the August delay had been a mistake, his stubborn independence. According to accounts from officers who were present or nearby when Bock received the news, the telephone conversation was tense. Hitler perhaps said something like, "You told me Moscow would fall in 3 weeks, Field Marshal. It has been 11 weeks, and not only has Moscow not fallen, but your forces are in full retreat. The great Prussian strategist has failed me." Bock's response, if accurately reported, showed both professionalism and barely suppressed anger. "I told you in August that we needed to attack immediately, mein Führer. I warned that every delay would cost us dearly. The decision to divert forces to Kiev and postpone the Moscow offensive until late September, that decision was not mine. I executed the plan I was given under conditions that resulted from decisions made above my command level. But explanations didn't matter. Hitler had decided. Bock was out." As Bock prepared to turn over command to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, he may have reflected on the cruel irony. He had come within sight of Moscow, closer than any other German commander would ever get. His tactical execution had been nearly flawless. The Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements had been masterpieces. But none of that mattered. He had failed to take Moscow, and failure was unforgivable. A fellow field marshal, speaking quietly to Bock after the dismissal was announced, perhaps offered this assessment. "Your crime wasn't failure, Fedor. Your crime was being right when the Führer was wrong. Hitler will never forgive you for that." The Moscow failure represented more than Bock's personal defeat. It marked the real turning point of the entire Eastern Front war. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The Soviet Union had survived its darkest hour, and from December 1941 onward, strategic initiative would slowly shift eastward. But Bock's story wasn't quite over. On January 20th, 1942, barely a month after his Moscow dismissal, he received an unexpected call offering another command. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, commanding Army Group South, had died suddenly of a heart attack. Hitler needed an experienced commander immediately. Bock, arriving at his new Ukraine headquarters on a freezing January morning, must have felt the weight of second chances. He was 61 years old, his health declining, his confidence in ultimate victory probably shaken. But he was a professional soldier, and professionals execute their duties. In May 1942, the Soviets launched a major offensive aimed at recapturing Kharkov. Bock, reading intelligence reports as the attack developed, perhaps recognized the opportunity immediately. Soviet forces were extending beyond supply lines, creating vulnerable flanks. The counterattack he orchestrated was a masterpiece of operational art. While Soviets pushed deeper into apparent success, Bock coordinated simultaneous attacks on both flanks. Within a week, attacking Soviet forces found themselves encircled. A Soviet prisoner from those battles, captured during the pocket's collapse, could have expressed the shock. We thought we were winning. Every day we advanced further. Political officers told us victory was certain. Then suddenly everything changed. German tanks appeared on both flanks simultaneously. Within 2 days, we went from attacking to being surrounded. The Second Battle of Kharkov ended in devastating Soviet defeat. It was one of the last major German victories on the Eastern Front. But victory at Kharkov couldn't mask larger strategic problems. On June 28, 1942, Bock's forces launched an offensive that split the Russian front near Kursk. The Soviets responded by establishing the Voronezh front under General Nikolai Vatutin, fresh forces positioned to threaten the northern flank. Bock, studying the situation, understood the danger. Vatutin's forces needed to be destroyed before they could threaten the entire southern offensive. The logical course was to pause the Stalingrad advance, eliminate that threat, then continue with secure flanks. It was sound military logic. It was also the cautious approach that drove Hitler to distraction. The telephone conversation between Bock and Hitler regarding Voronezh, based on accounts from officers aware of the dispute, could have unfolded something like this. Mein Führer, Bock perhaps argued, if we do not neutralize Vatutin's forces first, they will cut our supply lines as we advance toward Stalingrad. We must consolidate our position, eliminate this threat, and then continue. Hitler's response was likely predictable. I decide strategy, Field Marshal. You execute orders. Every week of delay costs us the Caucasus oil fields. Stalingrad must fall before autumn. Continue the advance as planned. It was the Moscow argument again, Hitler insisting on maintaining momentum, Bock trying to explain risks, neither willing to yield. On July 7, 1942, Hitler reorganized Army Group South, splitting it into Army Groups A and B. On July 17, 1942, Bock received another call from Führer headquarters. The message was brief. He was being relieved of command, effective immediately. This time, there wasn't even a pretense of health concerns. Bock's aide, standing nearby when he received the news, could have watched the field marshal carefully set down the receiver, straighten his uniform, and say quietly, I have fought for Germany for 28 years. I have commanded armies across half of Europe. I have won victories that will be studied for generations, and now Germany no longer wants me to fight. Very well, others will finish what we started. Fedor von Bock's active military career was over. The question of Bock's moral responsibility is complex and troubling. Bock was not a member of the Nazi Party, and he remained a Prussian monarchist by background, but he served the Nazi regime loyally as a senior military commander. He was a monarchist, a Prussian aristocrat, a professional soldier who valued traditional military honor. But he served the Nazis faithfully and skillfully. The victories he won enabled Hitler's regime to commit atrocities on an unimaginable scale. Although Bock did not personally plan Nazi atrocities, he was aware of violence against civilians in the occupied territories, and his successful campaigns helped make those crimes possible. Some of Bock's fellow officers joined the resistance, culminating in the July 1944 assassination attempt. Officers like Henning von Tresckow and Klaus von Stauffenberg concluded that their oath to Germany superseded their oath to Hitler. Bock never joined these conspiracies. According to accounts from officers who may have approached him about resistance, his reasoning reflected the dilemma many German officers faced. One such conversation, possibly occurring in 1943 or early 1944, could have gone something like this. Fedor, a fellow officer might have said carefully, There are those who believe Germany's only hope now lies in removing Hitler. We cannot win this war he has led us into. Every day he remains in command, more German soldiers die for nothing. Would you consider—" Bock's reported response perhaps captured the impossible position. "I swore an oath, not to a man, not to a political party, but to Germany. As long as Hitler leads Germany, my oath binds me. To break that oath would be to break everything I am. I am a soldier. Soldiers obey orders. That is what separates us from chaos. Even when those orders lead to Germany's destruction. Especially then, if every soldier decided for himself which orders to obey, we would have civil war. Better to go down with discipline intact than to tear ourselves apart from within." It was the logic that had guided Bock since cadet academy days. Duty above all else, obedience as highest military virtue. These principles had made him an effective commander. They had also made him complicit in one of history's greatest crimes. After his final dismissal in July 1942, Bock retired to a small estate near Lübeck. For almost 3 years, he lived in quiet seclusion, watching as the war turned increasingly against Germany. Stalingrad's disaster, defeat at Kursk, steady retreat across Russia, Allied invasion of France, systematic destruction of German cities. According to accounts from people who knew him during this period, Bock remained convinced of his professional correctness. In a conversation that may have occurred during winter 1944-45, as news arrived of another defeat, Bock perhaps said, "They are losing because they did not take Moscow when they had the chance. Every disaster that has followed traces back to that failure. I told them, I warned them. But no one would listen. I was right about Moscow. Being right means nothing now, but I was right." By May 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin, Bock received word that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, now Germany's head of state following Hitler's suicide, was attempting to establish a provisional government in Hamburg. As Germany collapsed, Bock appears to have decided on his own to travel north, possibly hoping he could still serve in some limited capacity. On the morning of May 2, 1945, Bock prepared to leave his estate. He was 64 years old, his health poor, his world collapsing. But he was still a Prussian field marshal. According to accounts of that final morning, Bock put on his old field uniform. The medals from 3 wars, the insignia that had been his identity since childhood. His wife, concerned about traveling on roads crowded with refugees and frequently attacked by Allied aircraft, perhaps tried to dissuade him. "The war is over," she may have said. "What can you accomplish that matters now?" Bock's response, if the account is accurate, showed that even at the end, he was still the soldier who had entered that cadet academy at age 8. Perhaps nothing. But perhaps I can still serve Germany in this final hour, even if Germany no longer deserves to be served. A soldier's duty doesn't end because the war is lost. They set out early that morning. Bock, his wife, her daughter from a previous marriage, the chauffeur, and a traveling companion. The roads were chaotic, clogged with refugees, littered with abandoned equipment, cratered by bombing. Allied aircraft roamed the skies freely. May 3, 1945. A road near Oldenburg. Allied fighter bombers attacked vehicles on German roads during the final days of the war, and one such air attack struck the convoy in which Bock was traveling. The pilot's combat report, filed later that day, was routine. 14-20 hours, attacked vehicle convoy on road near Oldenburg. Multiple direct hits observed, vehicles left burning. The pilot never knew who was in those vehicles. The attack was devastating. Bock's wife was killed instantly. Her daughter died moments later. The chauffeur and traveling companion were also killed. Only Bock survived, pulled from burning wreckage with severe injuries. He was taken to the naval hospital in Oldenburg. There wasn't much doctors could do. Germany's medical system was collapsing. Supplies were scarce, and everyone knew the war would be over in days. That evening, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein came to the hospital. The two old soldiers, who had served together since the First World War, spoke for the last time. Accounts of that final conversation are fragmentary, filtered through multiple retellings, but the words that were remembered captured something essential about both men. "Manstein," Bock reportedly said, his voice weak. "Save Germany." Manstein, looking at his dying friend, could have thought what he couldn't say. How do you save what no longer exists? But what he perhaps said was simply, "I will try, Fedor. Rest now." Fedor von Bock died the following day, May 4th, 1945. Germany itself would survive only 4 more days before surrendering unconditionally. There's a museum in Berlin-Karlshorst, on the site where the final German surrender was signed. There is a museum in Berlin-Karlshorst, where Germany's final surrender was signed, and its World War II exhibit covers the German-Soviet War, including how far German forces pushed toward Moscow and the areas around Khimki. A tour guide, explaining the exhibit to visitors, might say, "The German forces reached this point. Khimki, northwest of Moscow, is often described as the closest point reached by German forward elements, although the exact details of that episode are disputed. They advanced close enough that Moscow no longer felt like a distant name on a map, although claims about clearly seeing the city's spires are usually treated as anecdotal. But they never got any closer. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5th to 6th, 1941, and it quickly forced German forces to pull back from their forward positions around Moscow. So why did Bock almost take Moscow? The answer lies in his genuine tactical brilliance. He understood modern mechanized warfare as well as anyone in the German army. His coordination of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power was masterful. If tactical skill alone could have won the war in the East, Bock might have taken Moscow. But why did he fail? Hitler's strategic interference and the weeks of late summer reshuffling in 1941 narrowed the operational window Bock needed, and that lost time made the drive on Moscow far harder once the weather turned. Those 6 weeks of good weather might have been enough to reach Moscow before autumn rains and winter cold made the campaign impossible. The Rasputitsa, autumn mud, stopped the German advance more effectively than Soviet armies. No tactical brilliance could overcome the simple reality that vehicles couldn't move when roads turned to liquid mud. That delay came with a growing price in losses and in momentum, and it mattered even more once the weather turned roads into mud and slowed everything down. The Russian winter, the German army had invaded without adequate winter equipment, believing the campaign would be over before cold weather. As temperatures plunged into extreme cold, many German units lacked proper winter gear, so they improvised with whatever clothing they could find, and they watched weapons freeze and vehicles fail in the ice. Weapons froze, vehicles wouldn't start, men died of exposure by thousands. Soviet resilience and Zhukov's leadership, the Red Army had been battered, driven back, suffered millions of casualties. But it hadn't broken. Under Zhukov, Moscow's defenses were organized with depth and determination Germans hadn't anticipated. German forces had advanced beyond what their logistics could reliably support, and with every additional mile the delivery of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts became slower and more vulnerable to disruption. Every kilometer stretched supply lines thinner, made it harder to bring up fuel and ammunition, increased vulnerability to counterattack. A modern military historian, analyzing the campaign with hindsight, might offer this assessment. If Germany had captured Moscow in October 1941, and it's not impossible to imagine circumstances under which they might have, the war's ultimate outcome would probably have been the same. The Soviet Union had vast reserves of territory and manpower. Even with Moscow captured, Stalin's regime might have survived from alternative capitals in the Urals or Siberia, but the war would have been prolonged, the death toll even more catastrophic. In that sense, Bock's failure at Moscow, however devastating it seemed at the time, may have shortened the war. But what about Bock's moral responsibility? One historian, writing decades after the war, offered this judgment. Bock represents the German officer corps' central tragedy. They possessed honor without wisdom, duty without conscience, brilliance without morality. They told themselves their job was simply to win battles, that politics and morality were someone else's responsibility. But there is no such thing as apolitical warfare. Every victory Bock won extended Hitler's regime, giving it more time to commit atrocities. The question isn't whether Bock was a good soldier. Clearly he was. The question is whether being a good soldier for a criminal regime is even possible. In the end, Fedor von Bock's life poses uncomfortable questions about duty and morality, about soldiers' responsibilities in unjust wars. He was a man shaped by his time and his class and his training, a professional soldier who believed duty and discipline were highest virtues, who served Germany with absolute dedication even when Germany no longer deserved such service. He came closer to defeating the Soviet Union than any other German commander. He stood within sight of Moscow and watched victory slip through his frozen fingers. He was dismissed twice by a Führer who valued loyalty over competence. He was badly wounded when his car was strafed by an Allied aircraft during the final days of the war, and he died from those injuries the next day. The field marshal who almost took Moscow would be remembered not for how close he came to victory, but for how completely that victory eluded him. Close, in war as in life, doesn't count. History records only results, and the result was failure, military, strategic, and ultimately moral. A German soldier in a forward observation post in early December 1941 may have believed victory was only days away, but Moscow still remained out of reach. Neither did his commander. Neither did the army that had conquered half of Europe. They came close enough to see it, close enough to imagine parading through Red Square. But seeing isn't taking. Imagining isn't achieving. Fedor von Bock almost took Moscow. 19 kilometers separated him from victory. Those 19 kilometers might as well have been 19,000. Almost is just another word for failure. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this story about Field Marshal von Bock informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed learning about the closest Germany ever came to capturing Moscow, make sure to check out our other videos about German generals and the Eastern Front. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. We've got stories about Rommel, Guderian, Manstein, and many more fascinating figures from history.